We interrupt the Peppy Seltzer Classical Hour with this bulletin from the WPOD News Wire. Dateline, Chicago. A mob hit with enough explosive force to demolish an entire building. Suspicious individuals that get in the last word with Chicago's finest, and Bugs Moran's muscle in Al Capone's territory. These are just a few things making Dwarf detective Billibob Baddins regret taking socialite Julia Lessinger as a client. This case brings Billy to his man on the inside, a reluctant informant named Benny Roletto, who's acting more reluctant than usual. He does catch wind of a plot against Capone and a heist at the Ryerson Library. Leaving Benny in the alley, sullied and shaken, Billy focuses now on what DeMaio was up to. And now you know the story so far. We return you to our regularly scheduled programming here on WPOD, Chicago.
Chapter 5. Driving on the Wrong Side of Memory Lane. I think it would have done Benny's pixie-sized brain a good turn to spend an afternoon or two in a library. If he had even attempted to nurture a curious streak in that sorry excuse for a noggin, he might have then ventured to other libraries and begun to figure out why DeMaio was suddenly obsessing over them as meeting spots. The Ryerson Library, an institution that doubled as both a library and a museum, was just a short cab ride from where I ended up having lunch. It was a relief to have anything resembling an appetite after I left Benny Roletto, still searching through the garbage cans for his piece. The smell in that alleyway rivaled a female orc's perfume. Although it had only been around for about 30 years, the Ryerson already boasted a growing collection of artifacts, literary works, and essays from the smartest minds of the country. Although humans have the potential to be thorough and efficient information gatherers, their attention spans just won't last without some kind of distraction, be it booze, sex, or crime. And that's in both realms. Still, I can't complain. These were the distractions pushing me through the massive doors leading into the rotunda of the Ryerson. Benny had mentioned that DeMaio kept meeting him at a library, which confused him because he had overheard Capone planning to pull a job on a museum instead. My resulting hunch was that DeMaio arranged to meet at the last place Capone or the cops expected to find him, the scene of his own private heist. Now, it was time to find out if I was unlocking the right chest, and if so, to reap the rewards. Unlike the gloominess of the downtown circuit court, the Ryerson Rotunda was covered in bright white marble and accented by incredible columns reminiscent of Tresillian palaces, mighty impressive and mighty pretentious. As my steps echoed down the polished corridor towards the main desk, I found myself really hoping that the harpy sitting behind it was going to reveal her true beauty by the time I got there. Hope springs eternal. Her hair was a short-cropped field of brown, and I couldn't help wondering if the worry lines I saw were chiseled into the stone surface of her face. Her spectacles only magnified her cold, hard stare at what she was reading, as if she were intending to intimidate the words off the page for instant comprehension. If the corners of her mouth had been pulled back any tighter, they would have touched at the back of her head. In short, she looked as if she had been drinking a bad batch of homebrew bitter. Now, come on, Billy, are you being fair? I chided myself. Calling her a harpy? Drawing assumptions? How do you feel when people do that to you? How about you give this girl a chance, huh? As I drew closer to the receptionist, her features seemed to soften. There was a touch of light in her eyes. Maybe my guess about her had been wrong. I softly cleared my throat. She looked up from her daily paperwork and then looked down at me.
Can I help you, sir?
I think I heard hunting dogs in both this realm and my realm yelp in pain. That was a voice that could make a siren flinch. Ouch. Still, ever the optimist, I started off with a wink and a smile. You could, Toots, but I think we would get arrested for doing that in public. No laugh. A stare worthy of a scout. Yeah, even in my world, the academics were cold fish. The name's Baddins, ma'am, I continued discreetly as I showed her my credentials with a friendly grin. And I understand you had an artifact get up and walk out without even saying goodnight. I'm currently involved in a case that could lead to its recovery, but first, I'd like to know a little more about it. Anyone here want to talk? She still wasn't smiling, but I think she had found a moment of delight at the prospect of returning her attention to the work I had so rudely interrupted.
If you'll just have a seat, Mr. Baddins, I'll tell someone you're here.
Oh, this lady wasn't serious. I had to chuckle at the utter presumption of humans like this one. Somehow it was thought that your height was equal to your comprehension skills, so there were those who assumed me short in both. And just a moment before, I had been giving this battle axe the benefit of the doubt. Oh, that's fine, ma'am. I apologize if I was a little brazen earlier. I've been running around all morning. Guess I got a little lightheaded. As I delivered this, she continued to peer at me through her glasses, fighting the primal urge to go after me in much the same manner as her ancient ancestors would have hunted game. Really, it's fine if the Ryerson is too busy to talk to me, I added with a non-committal shrug. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take a moment and catch my breath before heading on to my appointment at the Tribune. I appreciate your time. Her scowl receded a bit as I took off my fedora, fanned myself with it, and then waddled over to a nearby chair. Besides making me appear shorter than my actual height, that waddle was a warning to Ryerson's old warhorse that I had no intention of masking my appearance and blending in with the background. It also said that if I was going to carry myself with pride in this situation, then I had nothing to lose in talking to the press. Sure, the press could take a shot at me, but if I could buffet this old bat's blows, would I really be put off by a pack of reporters? Probably not.
Sir?
I winced as she managed to grin. I knew that had to hurt.
Sir, if you'll just give me a moment, I'll get Dr. Hamill.
I replaced my hat, straightening it on my head as her footfalls faded out of earshot. In light of my comments and the frenzied pace she had taken down the corridor behind her, I would be surprised if Dr. Hamill weren't Ryerson's curator. As I paced casually back and forth, I could just make out the paperwork on her desk, still out in the open since she left in a hurry. Looked like the Ryerson was planning to dedicate a new wing with an exclusive shindig, attended by only the most exclusive patrons of the arts. Quite the who's who of Chicago's financial elite. DeMont, Evans, Rothschild. Funny thing that, the Lessinger family was absent from the invitation list. I was about to help myself to a closer look at this guest list when I heard the battle axe's high heels returning, accompanied by another pair of footfalls. The shoes ahead of hers weren't expensive. They sounded more comfortable, practical, academic. He was taller than a high oak and about as skinny as a valley pine, looking at me rather incredulously through wider-rimmed spectacles that were similar in make to the receptionist's. But unlike my helpful harpy, he was sweating. There were creatures of the undead I crossed, and had to kill again. Damn, talk about redundant. That looked healthier than he did. From the look of his slight build, I surmised that this was about as much excitement and exercise as he could handle. His plain suit and unkempt hair told me he was not used to these kind of sudden surprises. Assistants and tour guides usually dealt with people, while he usually dealt with further study. The prospect of an embarrassing state of affairs reaching the papers, though, was evidently enough to tear him away from his various parchments, scrolls, and testaments. This bookworm was trying his best to be the pillar of intellectual strength and control, but he only knew about brave face from tapestries and woodcuts. His smile seemed as painfully executed as his receptionist's. He bent at the waist, extending a clammy hand to me.
Good morning. Welcome to the Ryerson Library.
The bookworm adopted a bizarre, bird-like quality as he tipped his head to one side, giving his long, angular beak the semblance of a hawk's.
I'm Dr. Samuel Hamill, curator of the Ryerson. How may I help you, Mr.
Baddins. Billy Baddins. Well, Doc, you and I can go for a stroll. Someplace a little more private. I looked around us, hearing my own pipes bouncing off the walls. Someplace a little more quiet, I added sotto voce. We had made it about halfway down the main corridor of the Ryerson's offices before I gave the sound of our footsteps some company. Listen, Doc, you and me gotta have a talk, man to man, about something you lost. Now you can go on and just brush me off like yesterday's lint, but I would be out of line if I didn't tell you this caper may be bigger than the both of us. Dr. Hamill already gave me the impression he was jumpier than a wizard's apprentice, and about as mousy as one, too. I didn't expect the lashing he suddenly loosed on me like that of a line of skilled archers.
Mr. Baddins, I do not know for whom you work, nor do I care to know. This is merely a formality, and a warning, asking you not to take this particular matter to the press.
As if to accent his threat, and perhaps the most civil and polite one I've ever received, I might add, he removed his spectacles to polish them with a harsh, sharp breath and a clean silk hanky.
I warn you that our list of benefactors are incredibly loyal to this institution, and they would take it as a personal affront if the Ryerson were smeared by an unfortunate incident such as this. These people could make your life very uncomfortable.
I really don't like being threatened. Capone could do the same thing to you, I replied with a deadpan expression. His vigorous buffing came to a sudden halt, the glass spectacle having just snapped between his finger and thumb. He was no longer sweating, but with the paleness in his skin growing paler yet, I thought he was going to fade away in front of me. Nope, he never thought someone of that element would be involved, and from the look on his face, he couldn't understand why Capone would suddenly turn his interest on the Ryerson. Poor scholar, so smart, he was completely clueless. Look, Doc, why not drop the pretense? I shrugged, pulling out a small notepad and pen. I don't intend to tell you who hired me, nor do you want to know, but I'm here as a personal service to the pursuits of higher learning. I may not look it, but let me tell you, I got nothing but appreciation for the books. Research and private investigating go hand in hand, so how about we work together on this, huh? With the now broken spectacles in hand, Hamill's hazel peepers were either narrowing on me in some weak form of intimidation, or merely attempting to focus on the 4-foot, 1-inch pain in the ass that showed no signs of getting any better unless he played by its rules. Taking a deep breath, he cast a squinty glance from one end of the corridor to the other. So far, it appeared that no one but us had heard the boss's name dropped, or the reason why I was there. That reassurance gave him enough courage to keep his shield up, battered and dented as it might have been.
Mr. Baddins,
he asserted in his best official voice.
As curator of the Ryerson, my priority is this institution. I am not obliged in any way to divulge confidential matters to hasten your current investigation.
And being a private eye doesn't obligate me to let you know that Capone is watching this precious institution of yours, and has been for a long time, I fired back. Now you know who's the visiting team in your ballpark. You might even live longer because of it. So, quid pro quo, Doc. And I give you my word as an honest dwarf, it stays with me. Tell me what I want to know. What was lifted? Judging from how fast those gears in his noggin were working, Dr. Hamill was caught between a rock dragon and a hard palace. He didn't like it, but he knew he owed me, and he could tell I wasn't one to be two-timed. Perhaps he had been thinking of going to the police or even hiring some of my competition to recover this package. But if he truly wanted to make the Ryerson his priority, why hadn't he called anyone yet? Seeing as how the doc was being so secretive, whatever DeMaio pinched must have been one hell of a score. Dr. Hamill replaced his spectacles on the tip of his nose, the thin crack across the left lens catching the late afternoon sun filtering in through the cathedral-like windows. Loosing a heavy sigh, he motioned for me to follow him into his office. For a scribe's office, this was impressive. The room resembled one of Dunheim's main reading rooms, a veritable fortress of books in which you could virtually feel the magic in the air. Most of the wall space was taken up with awesome oak towers of bookcases, and where the shelves were full, other books were stacked horizontally across their brethren. The vaulted ceilings looked closer than they truly were, and any sunlight coming in through the windows appeared as flying buttresses of light, lending an air of romantic mystery to this cramped cubbyhole. Had Dr. Hamill's office housed apprentices muttering ancient languages to create balls of fire or to turn toads into bats, I think I would have shed a tear out of sheer nostalgia. On the bookworm's desk, a tiny fan's futile attempt to circulate the still air was overpowered by the smell of mold from long unopened books and the fresh ink of new editions. The books covering most of his desk were thick and monstrous, with a dozen or so bookmarks stuck at various points. 5 huge tomes remained opened and stacked on top of one another. Dr. Hamill set 3 of these volumes aside, still open to their respective places. I recognized this kind of setting straight from my own office, only with fewer bookcases and a little less impressive of architecture. It looked like I wasn't the only one handling a tough case as of late. I could tell the crack in his eyeglasses was making it hard to read what appeared to be long Latin passages in the open book before him. Emitting another heavy sigh, Hamill shook his head, looking up from the book and then down to me.
To be frank with you, Mr. Baddins, I wish I knew exactly what was stolen.
He began, keeping his finger at the last place he had read.
I know what the artifact was, of course, but as to its origins and its proper name, I have no earthly idea. I do know this much. There is no documentation of this piece anywhere in recorded history. If something like this turns out to be authentic, it would completely turn the academic world on its ear.
You mean your museum got hold of something that ain't in the history books? Some kind of Grecian urn or something prehistoric?
No, this artifact was forged well after the Bronze Age, and perhaps even the Iron Age. If we could only authenticate it with a written reference or even a simple hieroglyph, this find could predate the Scottish rebellions of the 13th century. In short, this artifact is either one of the greatest mysteries of our age or an extremely elaborate hoax intended to discredit the Ryerson.
Standing on tiptoe to get a glance at the open books surrounding Dr. Hamill, I was surprised to find they were all turned to sections concerning weaponry. My kind of weaponry. He had marked passage after passage on sword making, styles of blades, and the application of various edged weapons. These etchings and woodcuttings brought back memories of my part in Acryonis' great race wars, when dwarves battled against elves, elves battled against humans, and then finally the allied races battled against the black orcs. Days like that began with pristine armor, kissed with that smell you can only find in leather. On the setting of the sun, the leather's deep, rich brown color was soaked with a darker red, giving her armor a brilliant sheen of black, and that comforting smell of leather was replaced by the sharp tang of blood belonging to you, the enemy, and your buddies. Death always covered you, one way or another. When you bowed your head and closed your eyes to give eternal thanks to the fates for making it to the end of the day alive, you would find graphic images awaiting you behind those closed lids of yours. Goblins' howls of horrific surprise at the feel of a battle axe to the chest, faintly echoing in your ears. Yeah, those were good times. This might surprise you, Doc, but I got a bit of a background in ancient weaponry. Hell, this had been basic training for me. Mind if I ask about the particulars of this artifact? Are we talking about a sword here?
You are a perceptive one, Mr. Baddins,
Hamill remarked with a sneer as he motioned to all the sword-related books and papers about his desk. That's what I get paid the greenbacks for, Doc. Now how about dropping the enchanted gauntlet of snobbery and telling me something about this item you've lost track of? You know, people who think they're better than others never like being called on it. You ever want to cut someone down to size, and with a comment like that coming from a dwarf, pardon the pun, just call them on their bluff. Makes you a hell of a card player, and an even better private dick. Problem was, a guy like Dr. Samuel Hamill had the power to escort me out of the prestigious Ryerson Library. He was the clout and the authority. On the other hand, he now knew he had Capone keeping an eye on his hallowed halls, and he could tell I had no problem standing up to Capone. All 4 feet, plus 1 inch of me. Hamill went to say something, paused, then went to say something again, but paused again. Finally, slumping his shoulders, he handed me a series of notes scribbled onto a couple of yellowed sheets of paper.
These are the notes from the archaeological dig in Egypt from 2 years ago,
He began. I could barely make out the chicken scratch, but what I think he really wanted me to eyeball was the sketch. The doc walked behind me and ran his finger along the length of the drawing in my hand.
As you can see by this rendering, Mr. Baddins, this sword uncovered at the site is anything but Egyptian in its make.
Once I had gotten into the 7th and 8th grade level reading in the library, I did some research on the weapons, both past and present, of this world. Being a soldier, you ought to know who's armed with what, wherever you're hanging your shield and battle axe. I learned that Egyptians, Persians, and folks of that area preferred scimitars, real skinny, long, curved, and light. And I remember seeing descriptions of Chinese warriors charging into battles with similar blades, drawn and held high above their heads. I used blades like that to butter my toast. Anyway, the sword in this sketch resembled a 2-handed broadsword, more reminiscent of European than Egyptian make. Now I knew the Persians and Chinese liked their swords pretty and elegant, but this one was decorated beyond the point of gaudy, with jewels all over the guard and carvings along the blade and the hilt. There was no chance it was a true battle weapon, although its size and visible sturdiness suggested it could take a solid hit from my battle axe. Nah, I figured this weapon was better suited as a wall hanging in some prince's bungalow, something to impress one of those virginal princesses before taking them to bed and making them just a princess. With this sketch, the ambiance of Dr. Hamill's office, and all these books on weapons, Miss Lessinger's case was adding some serious asphalt to this memory lane of mine.
There's very little we can tell about how a sword of obvious Anglo-Saxon style and make found its home in ancient Egypt ages before the Crusades. Since its discovery, we have been trying to find any reference to this weapon in the tomb's hieroglyphs.
The Romans made it to England. Maybe the Egyptians did it beforehand and brought back some souvenirs?
If that were the case, this would suggest the existence of an Egyptian empire older and larger than Caesar's.
The curator replied with more than a measure of skepticism.
This would have to be an occupation that, once it fell, had all signs of it eradicated. Tell me, Mr. Baddins, of a civilization that could simply revert to its origins after the fall of a regime.
He had a point there. During the Elvish occupation years, the haughty ones imposed a lot of their culture on us. Some of it, such as how to build structures into a mountain as opposed to on top of a mountain, was useful. Their wine? Well, it made a great cleaning solvent, I'll give it that. We still have some structures in our villages with Elvish carvings and their haughty mottos and philosophies. If the Egyptians were feeling that ambitious, there was bound to be some lingering influence in both the conquered and conquering lands. And so therein lies the mystery, I mused, flipping through the notes associated with the sketch. How does a sword of European make find its way across the continent to finally come to rest in ancient Egypt?
This is just the top layer of the mystery, Mr. Baddins. According to the amount of sand and dust on it, the sword had not been there long compared to the other items we have found at the site, a few years at most. It was as if it just happened to find itself there in the middle of the Valley of the Kings, inside a sealed tomb. Our original goal for the excavation was to find out more about the dynasty associated with our site, but now we are simply trying to find any reference that could authenticate this sword's presence. If we do that, we could find an entirely new avenue to explore in ancient Egyptian civilizations. Perhaps this is a bit over your head, Mr. Baddins.
I looked up from the archaeologist's notes with a grimace. I'm short, not stupid. Try me, Doc.
The possibility of discovering dynasties or empires that stretched farther than Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan? From an anthropological and archaeological point of view, this is quite exciting. It would completely change what is currently accepted in academic circles as the history and evolution of civilization.
And you've lost it. Dr. Hamill gave a deep huff, as if insulted by my limited vocabulary. The temptation to just sock him in the mouth and end this once and for all was there, and it was strong. Instead, I turned my attention back to the archaeologist's rendering. What else can you tell me about this sword? Any other outstanding qualities about it?
Apart from being found in a sealed tomb?
He countered, flipping through a stack of papers on one corner of his desk.
I have a photograph in here somewhere that will show you a bit more detail. Very distinguishing. There is also the crafting on the blade itself. According to some of the participants of the dig...
Hamill gave out a little... as he produced a photograph sandwiched between the illegible chicken scratch of notes. Then he paused for a moment, staring at it intently. It was the most enlightened look the dear professor had worn on his face since my arrival. According to some of the participants at this dig, I asked, reminding him where he left me in this chat of ours. Hamill blinked.
Oh?
His eyes returned to the photo, then back to me.
Yes, of course. Yes.
The look of inspiration disappeared from his face as he continued.
According to some of the participants of the dig, the sword creates some odd harmonic anomaly when someone wields it.
I stopped writing for a second, first trying to figure out how to spell harmonic anomaly, then trying to figure out what the hell that was. You want to try that again, Doc? This time in the common tongue, not in the Ryerson dialect. He sighed heavily, rolling his eyes.
It made a noise, Mr. Baddins.
He continued, his tone now slow and deliberate, as if I were a mere apprentice to his all-powerful sorcery. Pompous ass.
Our team could not understand how or why, but theorized it was the engravings on the blade, along with its unique metal composition and the blade's angles that made it do so.
Unique metal composition?
It was in a sealed tomb, but there was only dust along the blade. no signs of rust or decomposition, and there were incidents reported from the team members that the sword emitted harmonized tones as it cut through the air.
He let out a dry cough that I soon recognized as an academic's chuckle, as he handed me the photo with a few documents still paperclipped to it.
It may sound a bit silly, but we're calling it the singing sword around here. I suppose calling it that is not extremely professional, but much easier than referring to it by its catalog name, item EW234450-112-MM, especially in communiques and conversations.
And how about these markings? I asked, my eyes straining to see them on the wide-angle photo. You said they were glyphs? He bent back the photo and a few more pages to a second photograph concealed within the notes.
This is a better photograph of markings along the blade. They appear to resemble ancient Chinese calligraphy, but only in the writing style. They match no symbols known for any kind of ancient language we have on record.
I took one look, and my blood ran cold. Dr. Hamill was right about the markings. They didn't resemble Norse runes, the Greek alphabet, Egyptian hieroglyphs from the Rosetta Stone, or even those cave drawings found in Arizona. Nope, that would be way too convenient, and way too friggin' easy on a dwarf like me. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, praying everything the doc was telling me and what I was looking at was all part of a really bad dream. But instead of waking up with my battle axe under my pillow and a shapely redhead bringing me breakfast in bed with a smile, I was still in the doc's moldy, cramped office in the Ryerson, the dust from volume upon volume of references, journals, and encyclopedias just catching the rays of a dying afternoon as I held onto a photograph that trembled lightly in my hand. The writing was Elvish. No question. The words were definitely written in an obscure Elvish script, not known in my parts for well over a millennium, a lot longer for downtown Chicago and ancient Egypt. Without bothering to ask, I tucked the close-up photo into my coat pocket along with my own notes. This time, I was the one who was sweating.
Mr. Baddins!
Dr. Hamill finally spoke, a little confused and maybe a touch curious as to what I was doing.
That photograph is museum...
Doc, I'll bring it back, but I got need for it. His eyes grew as huge as a Cimmerian swamp lizard's. If they were to have grown any larger, they would have probably popped out of this poor bookworm's head.
You know what the inscription says, don't you?
I had won the last thing I wanted from Dr. Hamill right now. His undivided attention.
Mr. Baddins, what is it? If you know something about this matter, I must hear what it is. This is the find of incredible significance.
I'm sure you could win yourself and the Ryerson a goodly amount of publicity and patronage with this discovery of yours, Doc, I said sharply, trying to mask my fear with a much-needed warning. Just listen to me. This sword is something you don't want to mess with. With that, I left his office almost at a dead run, with Dr. Hamill close on my heels.
You cannot leave here with that photo. I'll call the police.
Now, unless you've got a set of hooters that I can rest a shot of bourbon on top of and a tight little butt in need of a good spanking, I'm not too crazy about being touched. When I felt the doc's grip on my shoulder, I instantly turned into him, grabbing his wrist and striking his chest with my opposite forearm. Dr. Hamill was hardly needing the force I exerted to pin him against the hard marble wall, but I didn't spare a thought on how hard his head bounced against the wall, how winded he was when the air got knocked out of him on impact, or how hard his butt hit the floor after sliding down to the ground. The only thought in my mind was the writing on the blade. Fine. Call the police. Then they'll call Capone. After you talk to Chicago's finest, you can be sure that Chicago's muscle won't be too far behind. I left him slumped against the wall, confident that I got in the last word. But I got to give the doc credit. He was able to catch his breath a lot quicker than I had anticipated. He was back to shouting at the top of his lungs again, over the hurried footfalls of concerned colleagues now racing to his aid, over the murmurs of worry and sharp exclamations of my outrageous behavior, displayed in the hallowed halls of the Ryerson, came the one thing I really hoped wouldn't.
Mr. Baddins, what is that writing? I need to know.
Trust me, Doc, my voice reverberated down the hallway. You don't! I think I slipped the cabbie at 20, and the word "step on it" came out of my mouth. I think I was thrown to the back of the passenger seat as he took off. I don't remember. All my attentions were devoted to the Elvish script in the photograph. I knew enough of the language to work with it back in the day when elves and dwarves were working together for a common goal. It seemed like a lifetime ago when I was translating scrolls that held new orders for me and my boys. Since we were the allied races then, the orders were sometimes written in human dialects, but occasionally I would be called in to decipher the overly flowing calligraphy of the elves, who were calling most of the strategic shots. Let me just say that translating elvish script is tough. You have to take a simple phrase like, "Go get me a beer," and elevate it to a proclamation of universal importance. You also have to add in a few more words, all of the multisyllabic variety, to this 5-word request, and then adopt an air of, "Do you have any idea of how important I am?" when speaking. After interpreting Elvish for a meeting of the military heads, I usually downed a tankard of the local pub's hardest ale to counter my splitting headache. When I finally looked up, the cab was idling in front of my office building. Knowing the driver and I were more than square, the cab ride couldn't have been more than $5, and that includes the tip. I placed the photograph back into my pocket and bolted upstairs from my office. Miranda was there, letting the bill collectors know we would be square for the next 2 months. She had that smile on her face to say that it was, for a change, a really good Monday for us. Well, it was a good Monday until she saw me.
Billy? Billy, you don't look so good, hon.
Miranda. I stopped for a moment at the doorframe of my office and finally took a breath. I know I was probably a mess of sweat, paleness, and downright terror. I'm just thankful I hadn't pulled a Benny in my pants yet. Even if it's Joe McCarthy offering me the position of shortstop, you hold my calls.
Billy?
Just do it! Miranda knew that if I ever yelled at her, she would get an extra week's pay, as my way of saying I was sorry for my temper. She also knew one of my outbursts was a sign of a serious case of dragon shit hitting the fan. The office door shut behind me, the click of the lock making me stop for a second. In the perfect quiet, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears like pixie wings against window panes. I closed my eyes tight and gave my head a shake, trying to recover a bit of that calm, cool reputation that had taken me a year to build as a private dick. But all I could see in my self-imposed darkness were the characters engraved on the sword in that photograph. Elvish writing in Chicago, 1929? No. Please, for the love of the fates, no. It couldn't be. In the corner of my office stood a tiny icebox that kept a few consumable odds and ends, aside from the obvious. I pulled out a small block of ice and gave it a few whacks with the ice pick, chiseling out enough hunks to fill a tall tumbler. Soon my office was filled with the cracks, pops, and hisses of warm bathtub gin covering the ice, followed by a few quick gulps that polished off half the drink. Downing alcohol this fast always made me lightheaded, but it was helping me to calm down. Sort of. The chilled glass felt good up against my temple, giving me a moment's peace before I turned to the modest bookcase in the corner. No, my library was not as extensive as Dr. Hamill's, but it was just as essential to my work and recreation. Right now, I was focused on only one book, my private log for my service in Acryonis, shelved in between a few literary classics I'd enjoyed in my time at the library and a couple of books on baseball. I forced my legs to walk over to the bookcase so I could retrieve the old weather-worn journal. Go to the desk, I said out loud. Turn on the lamp, I told my hand. So far, so good. With the ice chunks providing a reassuring tink, tink, tink music in the background, I flipped through the journal till I arrived at an entry that would either confirm or deny a growing hunch. My last assignment, the raid on the Black Orcs' Keep of Tyrol in the dark realm of the north. Back in those days, we had been told that the 9 talismans of Acryonis were various ancient relics and baubles, all possessing magic qualities. Separately, they could do some damage. Among them was a ring that could unlock shadows, giving the ring's bearer total control of them, a chalice that could give whomever drank from it the power of a god, and a medallion that controlled time itself. Together, those 9 different doodads promised the world on a string, but that string was always attached to some provision that cost you hard. A few years of your life, if you were lucky. Your soul, if you weren't careful. Among these talismans was the Sword of Acryonis, a weapon of immense power that called upon the elements of darkness and could command demon armies to wipe out entire realms clean of life. Its wielder would know no enemy. Anyone standing before the sword of Acryonis would be laid to waste, and those behind it would either live to serve or feel its touch of death. The entry soon confirmed my worst fears. The elvish writing recorded in my journal, which I occasionally used as a reference for my translations, was a perfect match with the glyphs etched into the flat of the sword found in Egypt. The wielder meek shall possess this blade and bring about the servitude of a world. Even in my world, we didn't really understand what that meant. I do remember the same conclusion everyone in my team from the allied races reached. This whole servitude of a world thing was a bad idea, and the sword of Acryonis was a dangerous weapon in the wrong hands. As this case had now become one of those cases, I knew at last what I never wanted to know. The sword of Acryonis was in fact the singing sword, and now two of America's biggest crime bosses were looking for it. That was when I puked into my office wastebasket. A light rapping sounded on my office door as I gave a few more heaves, the bathtub gin leaving my mouth as quickly as it had entered. The room was spinning, partially from my home mix of gin, but mainly due to everything from the afternoon, now coagulating in my head like a severe belly slash on the mend. It was not out of the ballpark that the talismans could have surfaced here. I mean, among some of these rare books severely undersold in nearby dealer shops were the words and chronicles of my time. And then there was me, the dwarf now Dick in Chicago. So yeah, why not? Then again, what did I know about that magic shit? Not enough to fill a fairy's codpiece, I'm here to say. But what were the possibilities of another banished talisman finding its way into this realm and being christened, for example, Excalibur? Could the people who were burned at stakes and left hanging at the gallows on trumped-up accusations of witchcraft actually dumb mooks who had been sucked into voids of oblivion before me? How about this world's Chinese culture, filled with dragons? Could those dragons have been the unfortunate beasts on the wrong end of some wizard's spell? Stumbling away from the foul stench of my wastebasket, I picked up the photo I'd dropped. This photo of a sword that had just happened to pop up in an archaeological dig in Egypt, out of the blue.
This is just the top layer of the mystery, Mr. Baddins. According to the amount of sand and dust on it, the sword had not been there long compared to the other items we have found at the site, a few years at most.
Dr. Hamill had told me. Should I guess around the same time I arrived here? I heard the rapping again. Miranda's silhouette was flanked by two others, which were a little larger and fainter because they were farther away from her and the door.
Billy? You okay in there?
Yeah, Miranda, I grunted, but I really don't want to see anybody right now.
Billy?
Her voice quivered lightly, and then fell silent. She couldn't hide it that time. Fear. I looked up from the photo to see the other two shadows move closer to her. Shoving the photo into my pocket, I fought to walk a straight line to the coat rack. My hand had just made it around Beatrice when the shadows halted their advance, and Miranda found her voice again.
Billy, it's the cops. They want to talk to you about Benny Roletto. They just found him dead in some alleyway.
I let go of Beatrice and shook my head, hoping that the twerp hadn't gone to the trouble to change suits.